A man can outrun his own shadow, but in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of 1867, Wyoming, he can certainly try. For 4 years, James Whitmore had been trying. He had traded the suffocating drawing rooms of Boston for the endless expanse of the prairie, the judgment in his family's eyes for the honest gaze of a horse. Here at the Triple Crown Ranch, he wasn't James Whitmore III, the disgraced heir, the whispered about fugitive. Here he was just James, a man whose worth was measured not by his name, but by the calluses on his hands and the integrity of his word. He had built an empire of solitude, a fortress of solitude, walled by mountains and silence. It was a good life, an honest life. But it was a life built on a lie, and every sunrise brought the fear that this would be the day his shadow finally caught up. He didn't know that it wouldn't be his past that found him first, but his future arriving on the morning train, broken and freezing on a desolate station platform. Snow fell like tiny daggers across the empty train platform, each flake a merciless cut against the bitter December air. The wooden bench groaned under Violet Ashford's weight. She pulled a coat far too thin for a Wyoming winter tighter around herself, watching her breath plume in a white cloud before vanishing into the gray morning. The train's smoke had long since faded, taking with it her last sliver of hope. In her trembling hands, she clutched a crumpled telegram, 7 words that had detonated her world. Change my mind. Do not come. Sorry. 3 months of letters. 3 months of believing William Garrett's promises of a simple, respectable life. 3 months of selling every last trinket she owned to buy a ticket west, only to be cast aside like yesterday's news the moment she arrived. Her stomach growled a hollow reminder that the $17 in her purse was all that stood between her and starvation in a town where she knew no one. Passengers hurried past, their boots crunching on the fresh snow. A woman in expensive furs pointed at Violet, her whispered disgust barely concealed. They all knew. In a town this small, a rejected mail-order bride was a public spectacle. The shame burned hotter than the wind's chill. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, she was Miss Ashford of the Porter School for young ladies, respected and independent. Then her father's gambling debts, a scandal that had stripped her of her position, and her reputation had forced her into this desperate gamble. She saw the saloon girls across the street laughing as they swept snow from their doorway. Was that her only remaining choice, to sell the last of her dignity? The church bell chimed 10. 3 hours she had sat here, a statue of despair. She stood, her legs stiff with cold and fear, when a voice startled her. "Ma'am, that train's been gone near an hour." She spun to see a tall man in a well-made wool coat. His green eyes held not pity, but an unexpected kindness. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man at home in these wide-open spaces. "I'm quite aware of that, thank you," she said, her voice brittle. "James Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I own the Triple Crown Ranch. You wouldn't happen to be Miss Violet Ashford, would you?" Her blood ran cold. He knew her name. The humiliation crashed over her again. His expression darkened. "Bill Garrett's been my neighbor for 15 years. What he did to you was plain and simple wrong, Miss Ashford." The unexpected defense nearly broke her. No one had spoken a kind word to her in months. "I have arrangements," she lied, lifting her chin. His gaze flickered to her single bag, then to the empty platform. "The boarding house is full up," he said gently. "Miss Ashford, I have a business proposition for you." He must have seen the fear in her eyes, because he added quickly, "I need a teacher. My ranch hands have 8 children who need schooling. Room and board provided plus $20 a month. It's honest, respectable work. A teacher, the one thing she was, the one identity she thought she had lost forever. It was a lifeline thrown into a frozen sea. "Why?" she asked, the words sharper than she intended. "Why would you help a complete stranger?" James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains. When he looked back, a flicker of some old pain crossed his face. "Because I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly, to have people decide who you are before they know the first thing about your character." He extended a gloved hand. "Do we have an agreement, Miss Ashford?" She looked at his outstretched hand, then at the vast, uncertain future. This man, a stranger, was offering her a chance to rebuild not the life she had planned, but perhaps a life she could earn. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her handshake firm and warm. "We have an agreement." The Triple Crown Ranch was more than a home. It was a kingdom carved from the wilderness. The main house was built of log and stone, solid and unpretentious, with smoke curling from its chimneys like a welcoming hand. As James helped her from the sleigh, a tall, stern-faced woman in a dark dress approached. "Mrs. Helena Caldwell, my housekeeper," James said quietly. "So this is our new teacher," Helena said, her voice crisp. "Another charity case, James." "I'm here to work, Mrs. Caldwell," Violet replied, her chin high. "Not to be rescued." A flicker of what might have been approval crossed the housekeeper's face. The schoolroom was a revelation. 8 small desks faced a blackboard with tall windows that drank in the morning light. It was a room filled with possibility. "The children arrive at 8 tomorrow," James said. "They're a mixed group, ages 6 to 14. Some can barely write their name. The oldest thinks book learning is a waste of time. Think you can handle it?" "I believe the purpose of teaching," Violet said, feeling a spark of her old confidence, "is to meet children where they are not where we expect them to be." James studied her a long, appraising look. "That's exactly what they need," he said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. "Someone who won't give up on them." That night at dinner, surrounded by the honest, weather-beaten faces of the ranch hands, Violet learned of her students. Little Maria, who spoke more Spanish than English, the rambunctious Fletcher twins, and Annie Sullivan, a 10-year-old girl so traumatized by her parents' death that she hadn't spoken a word in 2 years. The challenge was immense, but for the first time in months, Violet felt not fear but purpose. This was work that mattered. As she climbed the stairs to her room, she glanced back at James. Who was this man who spoke with an educated Polish, yet lived the life of a rugged rancher? What secrets were hidden behind his kind green eyes? Her first day in the classroom was a battle of wills. Tommy O'Brien, the 14-year-old, slumped in the back, radiating resistance. "Book learning won't help me rope cattle," he challenged. "You're right, Tommy," Violet said, her voice calm. "But it will help you calculate how much feed you'll need for winter or write a contract to sell those cattle for the best price. Knowledge doesn't replace your skills, it strengthens them." The boy's defiance wavered. She moved through the day with purpose, turning ranch chores into math problems and frontier survival into geography lessons. But her greatest challenge was Annie. The silent girl sat perfectly still, her eyes huge in her pale face. Instead of forcing her to speak, Violet placed a piece of paper on her desk. "Would you like to draw something you enjoy?" Annie, the girl's small hand reached for the pencil, and she began to sketch. The result was a breathtakingly detailed drawing of a magnificent black stallion in the nearby corral. "That's Thunder," Tommy supplied, his voice softer now. "Mr. Whitmore's prize horse. Annie spends hours watching him." "Then perhaps Annie can teach us about horses through her art," Violet suggested. For the first time, a tiny smile touched Annie's lips. The day was a triumph. As the children left chattering excitedly, even Tommy paused at the door. "Miss Ashford, that thing about business letters, could you really teach me that?" "Absolutely, Tommy." As he left, a flicker of hope warmed her. She was making a difference. But her satisfaction was shattered by the sound of a rider approaching, fast, a man riding like he was fleeing demons. Through the window she saw him, Bill Garrett, the man who had abandoned her. He reined his horse in his face, flushed with whiskey. "Whitmore," he slurred. "Heard you took in my reject. Always a soft heart for strays." The insult hit Violet like a slap. James stepped out from the barn, his body a rigid line of fury. "Get off my land, Bill." "Not till I've had my say," Garrett sneered, pulling a folded age newspaper from his coat. "Got this from a passenger. 3-month-old paper from Boston. Very interesting reading. About a missing heir. James Whitmore III, son of a shipping magnate, disappeared 4 years ago after his business partner turned up dead." The world tilted. The expensive watch, the educated speech, the hidden pain in his eyes, it all clicked into place, with sickening clarity. Garrett's voice dripped with poison. Story says the partner Thomas Hartwell died after a dispute. Says James Whitmore vanished before the investigation was over. That's you, isn't it? The missing murderer. Murderer? The word hung in the air like a curse. I didn't murder anyone. James said, his voice quiet but strained. Maybe not, Garrett spat, but a man is dead and you ran. Now I think I'll go have a chat with your pretty new teacher, tell her what kind of coward she's working for. Garrett took a staggering step toward the house. In a blur of motion, James intercepted him. A single clean punch sent Garrett sprawling in the dirt. I said, James bit out his chest, heaving, get off my land. Garrett scrambled back onto his horse, blood trickling from his nose. You'll regret that, Whitmore. Before I'm done, the law will be calling. Enjoy your respectable life while it lasts. As he galloped away, his threats echoing across the valley, Violet sank into her chair. The kind man who had rescued her was a fugitive from a murder charge. His entire life here was a lie, and his past had just come roaring back to burn it all to the ground. A soft knock came at her door. It was James, blood on his knuckles, his face a mask of grim resolve. Miss Ashford, he said quietly, I think we need to talk. By the fire in his study, the truth spilled out. A story of Boston high society, of betrayal by his fiancée, Carolyn Peaton, and his business partner, Thomas. They planned to use my family's money to fund their own ventures after we were married, he said, his voice hollow. I confronted Thomas. We fought. He grabbed a fireplace poker. I tackled him. We went down hard. He struck his head on his desk. James stared into the flames, reliving the nightmare. He lived for 3 days, long enough for him and Caroline to tell everyone I attacked him in a jealous rage. Why didn't you stay? Violet whispered. Thomas's family had influence. The papers painted me as a violent monster. Even my own family began to doubt me. So I ran. I came here to build something clean, something honest. And you have, she said fiercely. This ranch, the respect you've earned, that's real James. Before he could answer, the drumming of hooves shattered the night. 6 armed riders. Lawmen. Bill Garrett works fast. James muttered, his face pale as he moved to the window. The lead rider dismounted, his badge glinting. James Whitmore, his voice boomed. Sheriff Tom Morrison, need to speak with you. This was it, the end of his carefully constructed world. What happens now? Violet breathed. Now, James said, squaring his shoulders. I stop running. He walked out to meet them, a man facing his fate. Violet watched from the window, her heart in her throat. But it wasn't an arrest. The sheriff was talking, pointing to a document. James's expression shifted from resignation to disbelief, and then to a fragile, dawning hope. Helena appeared beside her. That's not how men look when they're making an arrest, the housekeeper observed. They hurried outside. The sheriff turned to them. Was just explaining to Mr. Whitmore, there's been a development back east. A Caroline Peaton came forward last month. She recanted her testimony. The world stopped spinning. Admitted she and Hartwell conspired against you, the sheriff continued. Claims Hartwell attacked first, and his death was a result of self-defense on your part. The charges have been dropped. You're a free man, Whitmore. Freedom after 4 years. But as Violet looked at James's face, she saw not joy, but conflict. The choice was now his return to the life of privilege he'd fled, or stay in the harsh, honest world he had built. So, Helena said later, voicing the question on everyone's mind, you'll be going back to Boston then? James looked around at the ranch, at the faces of the people who had become his family, and his gaze finally settled on Violet. I don't know, he said, but she saw the pull of his old life, a ghost of wealth and status, calling him home. Why wouldn't he go? And when he did, what would become of the rejected mail-order bride who had just started to believe she had found a home? The next afternoon, James appeared in the classroom doorway. He looked as though he hadn't slept. Violet, he began, his voice low. I've been thinking. In Boston, I was James Whitmore III, an heir, a name. Everything I did was judged by my family's reputation. It was never really me. He gestured toward the classroom where the sound of the children's lessons, including Annie's newly rediscovered voice, drifted out. Here, I earned respect. I built something real. He looked directly at her, his green eyes intense. My heart says this is my home. The ranch, the people, and you. Meeting someone who understands what it means to rebuild a life from the ashes. His hands found hers. They were calloused and strong. Violet, if I stay in Wyoming, would you consider staying too? Not just as the teacher, but as my partner. In this life, in everything. It wasn't a proposal born of convenience or desperation. It was a partnership offered between two equals who had seen each other at their worst and chosen to believe in their best. Tears welled in her eyes. The man who had been accused of being a worthless coward in Boston was the most worthy man she had ever known. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, James, I want to build that life with you. Their wedding day dawned bright and cold. The ranch parlor was filled with wildflowers and the warmth of their found family. They spoke vows from the heart, promises of partnership and truth. But as James kissed his bride, the celebration was shattered by the thunder of approaching horses. It was Sheriff Morrison, his face grim with 3 stern-faced federal marshals behind him. James, and the sheriff, said, his voice heavy. I'm sorry. Caroline Peyton is dead. The joy in the room evaporated. Found in her hotel room in Cheyenne this morning, he continued. Looks like she took poison. But she left a letter, a suicide note claiming you came to her room last night and threatened to kill her. No, Violet cried. That's a lie. He was here all morning. I know, Mrs. Whitmore. The marshal set his eyes hard. But the letter contains details about your past business dealings, details only you and she could know. It paints a picture of you silencing her. I'm sorry, sir. We have to take you in for questioning. It was a perfect malicious trap sprung from beyond the grave. Caroline's final act of revenge. I won't run any more, Violet. James said, his hands framing her face as the marshals moved in. We'll face this. The truth will come out. She watched them lead her husband away, his hands bound on their wedding day. The injustice was a physical weight, a suffocating cloak. She was once again the woman left behind, but she was not the same woman. She turned from the fading riders to face the worried crowd of ranch hands. Her wedding dress was smudged with dirt, but her spine was steel. What do we do now? Mary O'Brien asked, her arm around Violet's shoulder. Violet looked at the faces of her friends at the schoolhouse, where she had rediscovered her purpose. She thought of the lessons she taught her children about gathering facts, asking questions, and refusing to accept lies. We prove his innocence, she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a power she never knew she possessed. Caroline Peyton came to Wyoming for a reason, and it wasn't just to win James back. We will find that reason. We will find the truth. The sun set over the mountains, painting the snow in shades of blood and gold. The real murderer had made one fatal mistake. They thought they were framing a disgraced Boston heir. They had no idea they were declaring war on the teacher of the Triple Crown Ranch. And they had grossly underestimated the rejected mail-order bride who had finally discovered she was worth more than all the gold in Boston. Now they were about to find out just how much that discovery would cost them.